quick little lesson about conscription in the North and the South. So the first thing a country needs when they go to war is they need men to fight in the war. They need to raise up an army. So it doesn't really matter what country it is, what war it is. The first option for a country is always to get people to volunteer. They want people to say, hey, we'll sign up and serve rather than other options. So one of the ways they encourage people to volunteer, at least during the Civil War, is they offered bounties. Bounties were cash bonuses for signing up. These were only used in the North because the South couldn't afford to do so. The bounties, they varied. It was anywhere from $100 to $400, depending on how long you signed up for. Obviously, if you agree to fight in the war for 2 years, you're not going to get as much as if you agreed for 3. Today, that doesn't mean much to us. $100 to $400 is an overwhelmingly amount of money. So to give perspective, the average yearly wage back then was $300 to $1,000. So if you got a $400 bonus for signing up and you only made $300 a year on average, that's a pretty good deal. Both sides had issues with desertion or deserting the army. This is when people leave. Once you sign up for the army, you can't a month in say, you know what, this isn't my thing, I'm going back home. You have to stay as long as you are required to. But one of the kind of weird things was desertion was common, but what we saw is people would leave and then they would come back. And then they would fight for 2 or 3 more months, and then they would leave for a month or two. And it's explained by farmers. Farmers in the spring would often leave for a month or so and return home because they would have to go back to plant their crops. Then they'd come back and fight during the summer months. Fall would roll around. They would leave again for a month or two because it's time to harvest. They would return for the winter. Anyway, despite the volunteers and the bounties, both sides will move to conscription. This is a fancy word for the draft. Conscription is mandatory military service. It's no longer will you join the military, will you sign up for the army. It's you are going to sign up for the army. We're forcing you to do it. This explains this image you saw yesterday, 30,000 volunteers. They're trying to get men, and we have the amount on the bounties or the bonuses. So the Union and Confederate drafts looked the same, but a few differences. So let's start with the Confederate side. They started their draft about 8 or 9 months before the Union did, in April of 1862. This can be explained because the South didn't have as many people, so they're going to run out of volunteers first. Their draft ranges were 17 to 50. So if you were between those ages, you, in theory, could be drafted. In the South, they only drafted white men. Union holds off. They don't draft until 1863. You can see their range, 20 to 45, is a little bit smaller, but they also only drafted white men into the military. Both sides had exceptions. An exception is something that keeps you out of getting drafted. Confederate side, if you owned 20 or more slaves, you weren't drafted. The thinking here was if you own 20 or more slaves, you own a plantation, and you're producing a lot of cotton, or you're producing a lot of food. So you need to be on your farm producing stuff that can ultimately help the South win. Another option you had is you could hire a substitute. You could go to someone and say, hey, I got drafted. I'll pay you X amount of dollars. Take my place. In the Union, obviously they don't have this slavery exception, but you could pay the government $300 directly to stay out of the draft, or you could also hire a substitute. So hopefully what you're seeing here is the exceptions, all 4 of them, are going to favor wealthy people. Wealthy people in the South didn't own 20 slaves. They probably don't have the money to hire the substitute. Same thing in the North. So often the war would be called a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, meaning a lot of people made money off the war. If you're a factory owner, if you're a big plantation owner, you're getting good prices for whatever you're producing. So you can get rich, but as far as the actual fighting is concerned, it's mainly poor people that are in the army. So I'll end with this image we saw yesterday. I'm sure your guesses were all over the place. This is what was known as a draft wheel. So it comes time to draft into the army. All the people that are draftable, if that's a word, you put their name on a slip of paper and you throw it into this giant wheel. So there's thousands and thousands of names. And then they would spin the wheel to mix them up, and then they would start drawing names. If your name gets drawn from the draft wheel, congratulations, you're